everyone. So today we have Jeff with us. Jeff, thank you very much for your time today.
Yep, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we really get started with the topic, it would be great if you can tell us something about yourself, who you are, what you do, about your organization, and anything you would like our listeners to know.
Sure. So I'm Jeff Reedy. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Scale Computing, which is an industry leader in what's become known as edge computing. I've been started Scale about 14 years ago. So I was doing edge computing before it had a cool name like this. And by my own background, I'm a longtime technology entrepreneur. I've started many companies over about a 30-year career of doing this. I'm a big fan of entrepreneurship in general, tech and otherwise. So.
Awesome. Okay, so Jeff, really you talked about entrepreneurship and your journey. So did you work somewhere before you got into this, or you started your company right away?
No, I started my company right away. I've had some kind of company that I've been running since I was 11. So
right.
It goes back a long time. Scale Computing is my third venture capital backed tech company, but probably my 10th or 11th company overall.
So you have not worked anywhere before you ventured into doing your own stuff?
No, that's right. I have worked places along the way, right? I've had companies have been acquired and so forth, and have happily, participated in the resulting company. But no, I never actually went out and got a quote unquote real job. So.
Sure. So how's your journey so far? Must have been like a roller coaster.
Oh, it has ups and downs for sure. I always say that, being an entrepreneur is much more of a lifestyle choice than it is a career path. So it is an all consuming kind of thing. I don't really think about anything else. There's no, a big item has been talked about over the last multiple years is sort of work-life balance. And I don't see the difference between work and life. So there's really there's no balance, right? There's times where I have to do stuff with the family. There's times when I have to do stuff for the business, but it's all rolled in together really. So.
Awesome. Yeah. So, life is like that. Life of an entrepreneur, I would say, is pretty much like this, as you're saying. So, really, what essentially is scale computing in your opinion?
So Scale Computing is effectively an operating system company, and we write software that runs applications in this new world of edge computing. And edge computing is a fancy marketing word that means not in a data center. So to the extent that enterprises need to run applications in locations outside of a data center, which might mean, at a factory floor, it might mean in a grocery store, it might mean on an oil tanker, it could mean lots of different things, but effectively locations that are not in traditional data centers, right? So traditional data center, racks and racks of equipment, people, power, cooling, all the stuff you expect. We're talking about applications which very often have to run effectively by themselves, or autonomously is the term that we would use in the industry, where you don't have IT personnel. Again, on board an oil tanker, there's no IT guy just waiting around for something to happen. And so building the software that can run applications in that kind of environment.
Sure. So in your opinion, edge computing and scale computing, are these two different things? Because you just mentioned that it's like a marketing term. So in your opinion, it's the same, it's different, it's related?
Yeah, no, for us, as for our business, right, it's the same. It didn't always have this term, right? There've always been applications that were running not in the traditional data center. And really that was amplified as we started looking, the last 15 years or so to the cloud. A lot of applications moved from traditional data centers or otherwise on premises into the public cloud, but not everything, right? And a lot of times this the not everything, right? Those applications that had to stay behind were not overlooked by those who ran them, but overlooked by how the industry thought of them, right? Quote unquote, everything was moving to the cloud, but that was never the case. There were always some applications that were going to run locally. And now as things have evolved with big data, AI, cameras, all these kinds of things, there's more and more data being generated that isn't going to the cloud. And so hence now edge computing has a word, right? Has a term. But in reality, right, it's always been there in some way, shape, or form.
Right. So, I mean, we have been seeing that there is a lot of data flow these days. I mean, huge piles of data is getting into the cloud, and if not in the cloud, maybe on-prem servers as well, as you touched upon. So do you think that edge computing is going to be effective in getting rid of these large-scale data centers or public sources or otherwise where we are keeping information? Is it going to be helpful?
I think it's an interesting question. I had thought, going back a number of years, that the traditional regional data center would largely go away, right? And that data would move either to the public cloud or to the edge, right? It would never end up in the middle effectively. That doesn't seem to be the case. I think I was wrong there. I think that you're seeing an expansion of, there's so much data, right? You're seeing an expansion of where that data resides across all these locations where it was originally generated on premises, in a regional data center and in the public cloud. I think that in reality, edge computing largely completes the vision that really is cloud computing, right? I think that when we think about cloud computing, we immediately think about public cloud providers, AWS, Google, GCP, Microsoft. But when we only think about big cloud providers, those are really just very large data centers, right? That's somebody else's data center. And it's a data center with massive scalability and lots of resources and all that, but it is still a data center. And really the term cloud implies this sort of amorphous thing, right? Where you have a unification of applications across all environments. And I think that edge computing, where you now can run those applications reliably on premises or in the data center or in the public cloud, really all those things together is what really makes cloud computing.
Right. So, I mean, you also talked about like what, in your opinion, the cloud really is. So do you think that in the future, maybe edge computing is going to replace the cloud down the road?
Yeah, I don't think edge replaces the cloud, certainly not in a one-for-one kind of swap, right? I think there are applications which move to the cloud, which never really belonged there. And we're seeing some companies move those applications back on site, right? So if you envision or imagine, right, that you were a CIO of a large enterprise, and maybe you had, for easy math, 100 applications. I'm sure you have many more than that, but we'll go with 100. And you decided one day that you were going to move everything to the cloud, right? Because you didn't want to deal with your data centers any longer. You didn't want to deal with on-premises computing any longer. So it's all going to move to the cloud. Probably 20 or 30% of those applications are the ones you moved first, and they're the ones that make the most sense. So email, for example, is never coming back on-prem, right? That's in the cloud. It's much better there than it ever was when we were all running Exchange servers and things like this, right? There's some applications that maybe they're fairly neutral between where, if it's in the cloud or on-prem, doesn't matter. But at the end, you might have 20 or 30 applications which actually are more expensive to run in the cloud, are slower, more awkward, worse user experience. But in the name of getting rid of everything on-prem, you force those into the cloud. Well, then along comes, the edge computing movement, largely driven by just more and more data and the need to generate, to use AI locally, get answers very quickly, store that data. And for one reason or another, you now have infrastructure on premises once again. And so now that you have to have infrastructure on premises, some of these applications which move to the cloud, well, they should come back, right? They don't make it, they're cheaper to run, they're better to run. And so, it's not a one-for-one swap, right? I think that in reality, the cloud, the public cloud, the data center, the edge, these are effectively physical locations, right? You can run you should run the application wherever it makes the most sense for that application and for your use case, not because specifically of the nature of the physical location.
Right. So, really, what we have seen is that for running cloud or applications on cloud, or maybe running your applications on-prem, you need to have like warehouses, you need to have server ranks, all the things that you talked about. So how do you think edge computing is going to affect that? So is it like you mentioned that it's not a one-on-one swap for sure, but is it like complementing the cloud, or maybe a hybrid approach is the best way to go about it, or maybe there should be separation of concerns? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it depends on the application. Certainly, a very common use case is a true hybrid approach, right? You're collecting data locally, you're processing that data locally, but then ultimately, either could be ranging from backups of that data to post-processing metadata goes to the cloud, into a data lake, into what have you, right? That'd be very common, right? We've seen instances where primary applications run in the cloud, but backups of that data exist locally, right? In the case of manufacturing, this might be more common, where for example, if the internet line were severed between the factory and the cloud, you can't stop running the factory. Maybe it's a steel mill, right? You can't just turn it off, and so they have the ability to run those applications locally. And in some cases, maybe that's the primary, or maybe that's the secondary. So it really is sort of a hybrid. Now, certain applications, maybe they are isolated, right? Maybe they're just going to run in the cloud, or just run locally. We see certain applications, for example, in Europe more so than North America, but video cameras being used where you're collecting data, and your image along with data about that image can be in certain jurisdictions considered personally identifiable information, and it can't leave that location, right? So it needs to run there for privacy and security reasons. So it really is a combination. Ultimately, my vision and what I believe is that we can use software to make all of these physical locations function as one, right? And the applications can move around, and really even the developers shouldn't need to necessarily think about where the application needs to run, right? The infrastructure itself can make that decision, and ultimately move the IT professionals who manage all this sort of infrastructure into a mode where they are positively contributing to the strategy of their businesses, where historically much IT has been the technology equivalent of an auto mechanic, right? Things break, they fix it. Things break, they fix it. Help desk, this sort of thing. And software is advanced to the point where machine intelligence and AI and so forth can really automate much of the administration of systems. And using that same kind of automation, then you can make these lines between edge and data center and cloud, amorphous, right? So it doesn't matter anymore.
So what do you think that a device qualifies for an edge computing device? So, we all have powerful smartphones in our pockets. An iPhone, a very comprehensive Android phone. They have enormous amount of power, a good amount of storage, and like a decent amount of RAM, right? So we all have sort of computers in our pocket. So can these devices be edge devices as well?
They certainly can be, right? I think that most of the time when we're talking about edge computing, at least today, and these things can change quickly, at least today, we're generally talking about not those endpoint devices that we're all carrying around, but the next server that exists up the chain, right? So sometimes that device is communicating straight to the cloud, right? You got a LTE 5G connection, off you go, right? But in other cases, right, it's something like that that's connecting, locally And the amount of data I think that is being generated in many instances is, we all intuitively know it's a lot, but I think unless you're in the industry, you don't necessarily know how much there really is. So for example, there's a customer of ours in the manufacturing sector. They make big metal parts, and they have the amount of data that the robots that work on these parts and the various sensors they have in the blast furnaces and all this sort of thing. The amount of data that they can generate about themselves is more than their local wired network can handle, right? So there's so much data that it can't even traverse the local LAN network, right? Much less out to the internet, out to the cloud. There's too much, right? I've seen the same thing in, one that's a little more intuitively obvious probably is in oil and gas, right? You have an oil platform, a drill running, so much data being generated, it cannot possibly get that data using today's technology into the cloud in real time, right? So, so being able to process that. At the same time, right, I think there's, there are many, interesting things that can be done, on sort of personal devices, the things that you carry around. And we all have experienced this, right? Is sometimes you run an app on your phone, which by its nature implies that the app is using the local CPU, RAM, and processing available on the phone. And it's a better experience than the same quote unquote app, which is nothing more than an HTML5 interface into, something running on the web, right? And we've all had this happen where you're like, I wish this were a real app, right? Because the experience is better locally. And that's, that's a taste, I guess, of what, edge computing is really about.
So what, in your opinion, are going to be some challenges in edge computing?
I think one of the biggest challenges of edge computing is one of management, right? So, and by management, I mean, how do you manage the devices and the applications when they're spread across potentially many locations? So in the traditional data center, you're talking about, if I'm an enterprise, I have hundreds or thousands of applications running on hundreds or thousands of servers that are probably in one or two or three physical locations, right? If something goes wrong with a server, an IT person walks in with a screwdriver and performs surgery on the server, right? In the instance of the cloud, the public cloud, right, that's still the case. I may, as the customer, not think about it, but there's one big data center at AWS or at Google or what have you, and somebody else is going to take care of that. When you're talking about the edge, you have the inverted problem, right? So instead of 1,000 applications on 1,000 servers in 2 locations, you now have 2 applications on 3 servers across 1,000 locations, right? And how are you going to manage that? And when you think about, that IT professional who's going to walk in with a screwdriver, that's much more difficult if I've got 1,000 locations that are all scattered around, right? And so managing that, right? Managing the deployment, the simple deployment of an application, right? If I have to deploy that application 1,000 times across 1,000 locations, it's a massive project, right? Very different than just deploying something in the data center. So software tools, technology can solve these problems, but it is very different, right? Break fix, even initial installation, right? Like if I have 1,000 trucks that I'm going to install servers on, I have to, somebody physically has to touch that truck, right? And you have to do it 1,000 times. So.
Sure. And what do you think are going to be the benefits? I mean, key core benefits, or you can say that, like, a couple of them.
Yeah, look, I think ultimately the benefit is you run the application where it makes the most sense. You're collecting and processing data in the most efficient way possible. And, you can be, resilient to issues like internet connectivity, which we might take for granted. We're carrying around our phones, but, a ship at sea may not have internet connectivity at all, right? There's lots of different, situations in which that can be an issue. again, ultimately, I think that it does complete this cloud vision where everything sort of feels as one.
So for scale computing, what's your vision? I mean, where would you like to take it? Like you want to like onboard new customers, or you maybe want to do the offering for maybe the end consumers or everyone out there? What really you want to do with scale computing?
Yeah, scale computing ultimately, we believe that that the edge is here and now for businesses, right? Businesses large and small are wrestling with how to best run their applications, how to process that data, and how are they going to manage all of this? The challenge of management that I mentioned earlier, and Scale has a solution to that, right? We automate the management, we make it easy, and we are in the process of deploying our software on more and more servers all over the world, right? If you look at a customer today, they might have 1,000 servers running Scale, and to them, it should feel trivially easy to deploy that. Even in a traditional data center, standing up 1,000 servers is not trivial, right? But that's the magic of the software, is that I can deploy this when if I'm a grocery store, if I'm in transportation, I roll out that new truck, the servers go on the truck without a second thought, and they set themselves up. The grocery store, you put the servers in, they set themselves up. And that's really where we're going, is automating all of this, what exists out there at the edge, from initial installation through ongoing management, such that IT, the personnel responsible for running those applications and the infrastructure, the applications feel the cloud, the edge, the data center all feels like one unified system.
So before we really conclude, what would you like to say about edge computing in general? I mean, or anything that you would like to share which we have not covered?
Yeah, I think that edge computing it can be very simply understood as the current move towards distributed computing. And what I mean is, we have been oscillating back and forth between centralized computing and distributed computing since the invention of the computer. So we had mainframes were centralized. We went to a client server architecture, which was distributed. We started moving to the data center and ultimately to the cloud, which is centralized. And here we are moving back to the edge. And, if you're not in IT, you wonder like, well, what in the world, why does this happen? And the answer is the bottlenecks move around, right? The current bottleneck is the speed of the network. And, in some cases, the speed of light is not fast enough to get an answer in the time that you need. If you're, if you were driving a Tesla and a deer ran out in front of the car, do you want the Tesla asking the data center 2,000 miles away, what is that? And do I need to stop? Right. And it's silly to think about, but there's a real physics problem there, right? If you're going 70 miles an hour, 4,000 mile round trip at the speed of light, you'll go 8 or 10 feet before you get an answer, right? It's not fast enough. So of course, right, that stuff runs locally. Now, not every instance is quite like that, but these are the things that we wrestle with in IT infrastructure, and the edge is a natural evolution of what's happening. And I suspect 20 years from now, we're talking about something else that's more centralized, right? It's going to move back and forth. So, but there are solutions out there, right? The edge is not scary. It's just another place to run applications. There's software to make that easy. We're no longer in a world, the old world of, every time I stand up a server, I got to, deploy a team of IT professionals to create this mini data center. We're past that, right? We have automation and tools to make that happen and solve these problems.
So Jeff, in the end, I would like to really thank you for your time today and sharing the insights about edge computing and scale computing. I look forward to hosting you again with some different topic on PettyTech. And till then, really, thanks again.
Hey, thank you for having me.